think we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Alexis. I'm the coordinator for the Tryon Creek Watershed Council, and I'm really excited to bring you a two-part science talk presentation today. Normally, we would be meeting in person at the Lucky Lab and getting to learn all this cool stuff over pizza, but we're all at home staying safe and keeping our community safe by doing so. Thank you all for joining us after an evening of what I'm sure has been plenty of screen time for everyone. I wanted to just start with a thank you to Brooke Silver and Chad Smith for bringing this presentation to us tonight, and a couple little housekeeping things. I see most of us are on mute and most of us have our video off as well. Speakers always love to see faces, so if you're willing to have your face on, that would be lovely for everyone. When we enter presentation mode and the screen goes full screen, you'll be able to adjust how big the thumbnail of other people's video faces are, and that way you can kind of less obstruct the PowerPoint itself with people's faces. Another thing I wanted to say is we're gonna sort of pause halfway through after Brooke's presentation for questions and answers, and then we'll have another session for Q&As about Chad's presentation, and then Brooke's as well at the very end. But we'll get you all wrapped up by 7:30. And I also wanted to say a thank you to our funders. This is funded by the Bureau of Environmental Services Community Watershed Stewardship Program. And so that's what allows us to bring you these science talks as well as other workshops and plants and things like that. So feel free to pop any questions in chat. I will sort of moderate and read those out to our speakers when the time is appropriate. So thank you all. I think we're ready to get started. Brooke or Chad, do you have anything before we get going?
No, I'm pretty excited. Alexis, did you have a poll that you wanted to try out?
I did. I forgot I set up a poll just out of curiosity of who all is tuning in tonight. I'm going to launch the polling. I'm just curious how many of everyone that's tuned in tonight are, live or work in the watershed versus are from the metro area as a whole. And whether or not this is your first time joining us. So some of you I know I've met in person, and some of you, your names are totally new to me. So looks like a third of us have voted, and those of us that are, using just our phone to call in maybe might not be able to vote as easily. Look at that, 70% of folks have voted, 74%. All right, I think they're still ticking in. I'll give you all just a little bit more. Thanks for that reminder, Brooke.
Oh, no, I'm excited. Thank you for setting up these polling questions, Alexis. It'll make the online forum that much more exciting.
Yeah. All right, I haven't seen anyone else vote in just a moment, so I'm gonna go ahead and end our polling. So here we go. So most of us do live and or work in the Tryon Creek watershed. Or just over half of us, actually. And then for a lot of you, it's your first time tuning into the Watershed Council stuff. So thank you all so much. Welcome. The Tryon Creek Watershed Council works not just in the state natural area, which is what most of us are familiar with, but with the whole Tryon Creek watershed. So the headwaters that start in Multnomah Village and trickle down through Southwest Portland and Lake Oswego, and then finally put out into the Willamette. So we do a bunch of stuff with, community education, managing restoration projects, and so on. There's the results for all of you. So that's what I forgot to do, Brooke, heads up. I can stop polling, but then I have to share the results. So that's a two-step process for us. All right, now I'm gonna stop sharing the results. And Brooke, it is all you.
Great, I will get my PowerPoint started here. And here we go. Also, here's a new cool thing. Let me see. Oh, I don't think I can do it. Okay. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in tonight. I'm really excited to share some of the work we've done monitoring in Tryon Creek. And so far, at the beginning, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's come out with us. You know, we've worked with a lot of people, especially the City of Portland Bureau of Environmental Services and the Tryon Creek Watershed Council, along with Friends of Tryon Creek, ODFW, state parks, the Department of Transportation, and City of Lake Oswego. And I counted up not long ago how many people have come out into the field with us in the last 15 years. And it's 70 people. So I bet a lot of you on this call even have come out with me. So that's super exciting. And just want to thank everyone for your help and interest, and especially for some of the people who had the opportunity to carry a wet electro fisher upstream in the net. So after almost 15 years of sampling, we've shown how valuable Tryon Creek is to our region. You can see that there's a little picture of a beaver dam, which is up in the state natural area, which is great for fish, and another photograph of a coastal cutthroat trout, really beautiful fish that lives in Tryon Creek. And right here, so we have our first poll. Let's see, I am going to launch it. So, how do you think Tryon Creek's temperature compares to the Willamette River in the summertime? And this is in degrees Fahrenheit. Is Tryon Creek 9 degrees warmer, 4 degrees warmer, the same temperature, 3 degrees colder, or 12 degrees colder? So we give you guys a few minutes to figure out what you think the average Tryon Creek temperature is.
Brooke, can I ask a clarifying question? Where in the watershed?
This was a study done by DEQ, and they were measuring the water temperature, I believe, in the Confluence area. So that's like about 300 meters upstream of the confluence with the Willamette River.
Thanks.
Sure. All right, we're at about 70, 80. So almost everyone's voted. So I'm going to go ahead and end polling. And it looks like the winner, a lot of people think it's 3 degrees colder. I have the answer for you. It is actually 12 degrees colder, which is pretty fantastic. That is something that makes Tryon Creek's watershed really important to the region. It provides cold water refuge for fish and like salmon and trout, especially in the summer months, especially when the water in the Willamette's really warm. And I know a lot of you are really familiar with the Tryon Creek watershed, and that it's special in that it's tributary to the Willamette River, which in turn flows out to the Pacific, or flows out to the Columbia River, and then to the Pacific Ocean. And there are no dams along the way, so that's pretty cool. And while 20% of it is protected by natural areas, which is also pretty incredible, it's in the lower part of the watershed. And while a huge portion of it is protected, that leaves 80% that is urbanized, and that's mostly in the headwaters. And with urbanization comes culverts. So culverts can limit fish passage. So I want to point out a few landmarks that we're going to refer to throughout the presentation. Down here at the Highway 43 culvert, I think a lot of you are familiar with that one. That's the largest one, and that's about 300 meters upstream of the Willamette River, and that one can potentially limit fish passage, especially at high flows. Moving up, let's see. There we go. The next one is the Boones Ferry Road culvert, and that one is the one that's currently under construction to become a bridge, which is very cool. And then up here, the Maple Crest Drive culvert, it's a small culvert, and that I wanted to point out, that's where we ended our surveys for our stream surveys, because we get into private land and that's the end of the line for us. And then in 2019, last year, with the help of the Tryon Creek Watershed Council, we were able to add Nettle Creek through the park and up to Atwater Road to our abundance estimate. So let's see. So I'm getting used to this Zoom thing. I have one screen. Every time I look at my PowerPoint, something pops up over it. So I know you'll all bear with me. We're all getting used to this stuff. So therefore, there are many groups that are working to replace or retrofit these culverts, and doing that will improve passage, not just for fish, but for people, for animals, and stream processes like sediment and wood. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the timeline of some of the things, not everything that's happened in Tryon Creek. So in the 1920s, the Oregon Department of Transportation constructed the Highway 43 culvert. And then in 2005, the US Fish and Wildlife was interested in looking at lamprey presence and distribution in the region. So we began doing lamprey surveys in 2005, and they lasted all the way through 2017. And in, oops, come back. And in 2008, the City of Portland partnered with Oregon Department of Transportation to retrofit the Highway 43 culvert baffles to make them more fish friendly and raise the pool. Instead of a perched culvert, they raised the level so fish could swim in. And that was the time that we began conducting abundance estimates of trout upstream of the Highway 43 culvert, and those went all the way into 2019. And then in 2010 or 2012, the City of Portland enhanced the Confluence Habitat. They widened the stream channel and graded the banks and added large woody debris and rocks. And that was when Fish and Wildlife began our Confluence Habitat monitoring project down below the Highway 43 culvert. And then in 2019 was when we were able to add the Nettle Creek abundance estimate. So I have a couple of photographs from back in 2006. On your left, you can see what the baffles looked like before. And there weren't really very good pools for fish to rest in while they tried to make their way upstream. And especially for lamprey, we wanted to work with them to help create these notched baffles so fish have a larger resting place and can maybe go around a rounded corner rather than these hard corners. And then this is also a photograph of the culvert, which used to have a jump in for fish when the pool level was low. And then in 2008 was when the pool level was raised so fish could swim in instead. And you can kind of see the rocks and stuff that were added to it. So all of that work was giving us the opportunity to monitor and study the fish before and after this work was done, that was done to improve passage and habitat conditions. And our goals was to collect data before each phase of these restorations to the Highway 43 culvert. So the 3 phases, the first one was just the one that I talked about, was the Highway 43 culvert retrofit. The second phase was the Confluence Habitat enhancement, which was adding large weedy debris like I talked about earlier below the Highway 43. And then the third phase, which hasn't happened yet, is the culvert replacement. So our goals are to establish a baseline to compare species presence or absence, their distribution and abundance. And these comparisons can be used to document any change that's happening over time after passage improvements are completed. And then to determine if the goals are met for these habitat enhancements and restoration projects. We're looking to demonstrate floodplain connectivity through use of the stream and upstream passage. So this can all inform future project designs by helping us understand what habitat enhancement actions that promote recovery for fish. Which brings us to our first question. Let's see if I can make that go away. Our first question back in 2005 are lamprey present or absent? And we started annual electro fishing surveys for lamprey. And as you can see over there in red on the map at the very bottom, we electrofished from the mouth to the Highway 43 culvert. And then we electrofished 6 different reaches through Tryon Creek State Park, which were kind of randomized and spatially balanced in order to see if any lamprey were present or absent. And we were looking for 2 species of fish. We're looking for the Pacific lamprey or the Western Brook lamprey. And both are native to the Pacific coast. Pacific lamprey are really cool. They have a greater range. They reach all the way north, the coast of North America to Asia, while Western Brook lamprey are native to coastal Southeast Alaska to California. And the photograph on the left is a juvenile Pacific lamprey, and the one on the right is an adult Western Brook lamprey. And Pacific lamprey are much larger than Western Brook lamprey when they're adults because Pacific lamprey, like salmon, are anadromous, and they go out to the ocean as adults to feed parasitically on other fish and even mammals before they return to spawn. They're highly significant to the Native American tribes, and also like salmon, there have been declines in their numbers. So a lot of that's primarily due to passage barriers. And unlike salmon, they can't jump. Many groups are working to help the lamprey with some of these passage issues because, you know, if you have to use your face to crawl up a dam to get upstream, it's a lot more difficult than being able to jump up a fish ladder like a salmon can. Western Brook lamprey are pretty cool also. They don't go out to the ocean. They stay in freshwater their whole lives. And they're not parasitic. They actually don't even feed as adults. They only filter feed in the sediment when they're juveniles. And there's so much to learn about lamprey. We can go on and on. So downstream of the Highway 43 culvert, we, out of the 13 years that we did our annual surveys, we detected lamprey for 9 of those years. And we found juvenile Pacific lamprey, and we found both juvenile and adult Western Brook lamprey. And then in 2005, we had a handful of unidentified lamprey because we were probably still learning how to identify them because we hadn't been studying them for very long. However, upstream of the culvert, in all of our surveys, we did not detect any juvenile lamprey above the culvert. So to look for any potential adult Pacific lamprey, we conducted spawning ground surveys because if they were coming back to Tryon Creek to spawn, we were going to be there to find them. So between 2006 and 2015, we did 76 surveys looking for any adult lamprey in the water or any carcasses. So we did not see any adult Pacific lamprey. We didn't see any live fish. We didn't see any reds, which are the nests that they build to spawn. And we didn't see any carcasses. What we did see below the Highway 43 culvert in the Confluence area, we did see some live fish, adult Chinook, coho, and steelhead. Sometimes in the early fall would poke their heads in. We never saw any adult Chinook or coho or steelhead reds down there. And then a few times in 2015, we saw some unspawned carcasses. So if some of you remember in 2015, it was a really hot drought year. So we think that some of those adult fish went into Tryon Creek seeking refuge for the hot Willamette water. And with the stress, they probably died in there before they had the chance to spawn. So upstream of the Highway 43 culvert to Boones Ferry Road, we didn't see any adult Pacific lamprey, no live fish, no reds or carcasses. And we did not see any adult Chinook, coho, or steelhead fish, reds, or carcasses. But don't worry, we saw coastal cutthroat trout reds in the spring, which is great. I mean, that's the dominant fish that's up there, and we would expect to see their reds in the spring. So we were out there looking. Which brings us to our next question. We wanted to look at a naturally occurring and self-sustaining population of fish in Tryon Creek and see how many there were. So we chose the coastal cutthroat trout because we knew that they were up there, but we didn't know how many there were. And we wanted to see if that number changed over time. So every other year, starting 2008 until 2019, we did some electro fishing surveys to collect fish and estimate how many there were. So in red, you can see this was our reach that we did every other year between the Highway 43 culvert upstream to Maple Crest Drive, and then a little portion of Arnold Creek to Arnold Creek, where Boones Ferry Road comes in, up to Arnold Creek Road.
Hey, Brooke,
And then
I might just pop in one thing for folks to know. The default display of going into full screen has four video thumbnails. If you hover over that with your mouse, you can collapse the thumbnails so they're a little bit smaller. You can also click and drag the video thumbnails around. And I just wanted to pop in and say that because I had mine in the default still and it was covering that red line you were talking about. So that just might help other folks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alexis. I know I've been kind of moving things around on my little screen as they come up. So yeah.
Totally. Awesome, thanks.
Sure. So I got some photographs off of the Tryon Creek Watershed Council's website, and this on the left is the stone bridge before it was turned into the Nettle Creek Bridge in 2014. So you can see that there was a culvert there that probably limited fish passage because they'd have to jump upstream into that, and that is not very easy for all fish. And then you see that beautiful bridge that fish can easily swim upstream now. So I just wanted to point out that our abundance estimate, it only occurred after the bridge went in. So we don't have any before abundance estimate, but we'll get to that in a minute. First, I wanted to show you, I want to show pictures as much as I can. We're all used to looking at figures and words. So this is a big reason why we get into becoming fish biologists, is for the fun part of being out in the field that sometimes is wet and mucky, but is always fun and fulfilling. So this is one of the really fun ways that we use to capture fish in the stream. This is called electro fishing. We use an electric current in that little backpack there to briefly stun the fish. And then my friend right here with the net quickly scoops the fish out of the stream, and the fish is collected in a bucket of water that we'll carry with us until we stop and measure it. So that's how we can kind of cheat and get at a lot of the fish that are hiding out in habitat. And here is a picture of us working up those fish that we collected. So collecting this information requires several sets of hands. We have someone who's measuring the length of the fish and taking the weight of the fish. Someone will tag the fish with a tag to give it a unique identifying number. Sometimes we'll take a genetic sample from a fish. We need someone standing by to record all of that data. And also a super important job is that there's someone else that's monitoring the health and well-being of these fish. Because in order to be able to take them out of the water and handle them, we have to place them in an anesthetic bath to relax them. So we want to make sure that the fish are falling asleep appropriately, and then coming back and being ready to go back in the stream, ready to swim. So there's a photograph of a coastal cutthroat trout, and that is probably an adult-sized coastal cutthroat trout, and we would see quite a few of those in Tryon Creek. And not a lot of people realize that fish like that are in such a small little stream. Which brings us to poll number 2. So we did our abundance estimate, and for you guys, how many coastal cutthroat trout do you think were estimated in the survey area, which is upstream of Highway 43 and the culvert? So everything in red that I showed earlier. So I will go ahead and launch this poll and give you everyone a chance to start voting.
As one of the administrators, it's really cool to watch the bars jump forward as all of your votes come in. It's pretty neat to see it wiggle around. Even though you can't, we'll share it.
It's really exciting. It's like watching a race.
Yeah, it is.
So it looks like we've got just about everyone has voted. So I'm going to end the polling and share the results. It looks like most people guessed 300 to 600 fish. So that's close. The answer is 600 to 900 fish. So if you guessed that many, you are correct. So even more than most of you thought. And in the area, so sometimes I just want a number. And I just wanted to do that for everyone. So I can just come out here and say there are 722 coastal cutthroat trout upstream where we surveyed. Wouldn't that be easy? But it's not that simple. You know, of course, we're using statistics and this is an estimate. And among years, there's always variability. So that's why we're able to repeat these estimates from year to year. So to compare year to year, we looked at fish density. And we looked at the number of fish per meter surveyed. And so you can see that there's some variability and it's natural between years. The population overall appears relatively stable. And the average population density we've seen in other populations can vary seasonally with habitat type and flow, even temperature and location. So if it's warm and dry one year when we're sampling, the fish might be moving further up into the headwaters where it might be, they might not be moving around. So this is why we use statistics to estimate the number of fish, and it gives us kind of a minimum and maximum range so we can be fairly confident in our number. So that first section that we surveyed between the Highway 43 culvert up to Boones Ferry Road, which is almost entirely in the Tryon Creek State natural area. Let's see, move that. We estimated between 474 and 660 fish. And then I just wanted to break it down and say that's about a fish for every 100 feet that we sampled. And this way we kind of compare between the different sections of the stream. Now above Boones Ferry Road and that portion of Arnold Creek, we estimated there was about 100 fish. And looking at the area that we sampled and how many we saw, that's a little bit lower, about one fish for every 150 feet. And then last year, when we were able to go to Nettle Creek, although we only estimated about 63 fish, the density was highest at one fish for every 50 feet. So fish were found both upstream and downstream of the Nettle Creek Bridge, and it looks like there's passage and quality habitat that's being provided for coastal cutthroat trout right through there. So that was a really exciting thing to be able to add to our estimate this year. So now we're next to our last question. Our last question is also our biggest question. After the Confluence Habitat was enhanced, we wanted to know how fish use this Confluence Habitat. And we did monthly and weekly surveys in this area between 2012 and 2019. Here's a photograph of before the habitat enhancement where the channel was had really steep banks. And then afterwards the banks were graded. It created off-channel habitat for fish. So when the Willamette fills up in the wintertime and springtime and kind of floods, it goes out onto these banks and into the large woody debris that was placed there. And a lot of juvenile salmonids, coho and chinook juveniles can go swim into those root wads and stay safe and catch their breath as they are making their way out to the Pacific Ocean. And there was a lot of native plants put in there. And so if you went back there now, it's amazing how much everything has grown in, and tons of alder. There's quite a bit of riparian vegetation now, when this photograph was taken right after it happened. So like I said, our objective our question was pretty big, so we had to have several objectives on how fish use the Confluence Habitat. So a few of those objectives were we wanted to describe the community of fish species that were in that area. We also wanted to look at the relative abundance of those species in that area. And we also wanted to look at the migration behavior of salmon and trout that are using that area. So the methods we used, we brought back some electro fishing because that for us is one of the best ways to collect fish in a wadable stream. and get our hands on a fish so we can give it a tag and take any genetic samples. But this time, that scour pool below the culvert, it's pretty deep. And my waders are only going up to 4 feet exactly, 4 feet 1, and I'm really wet. So we used a seine. And what we do is it kind of corrals fish around the perimeter of the pool, and then we drag it to the beach, and we're able to easily net the fish out of that net into a bucket so we can then take them and measure them. And I have to use it. It's my favorite pun that I came up last time I was talking to Alexis, and that it's an insanely efficient way to collect fish. So this type of habitat, it worked really well. Which brings us to our third poll. What percentage of fish captured in the Tryon Creek confluence do you think were native species? So let me launch this poll. What percent were native species? And while you're voting, I'm gonna clarify some of that. So a native fish is a fish that is part of the ecosystem and is developed over hundreds or thousands of years in an area. While a non-native fish, or sometimes we call them introduced fish, we use it interchangeably, those fish were brought here sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally, and they're brought to a new place or a type of habitat where they weren't previously found. And you might be asking, I've also heard of invasive fish. An invasive fish is a fish that's been introduced, but it can quickly establish in many sites. It grows quickly, it spreads to the point where it can disrupt communities and ecosystems. So one thing to note is that not all introduced fish are invasive. So out of all the fish, we captured a lot of them. What percentage of those fish do you think were native species? So I'll go ahead and end the polling and share the results. So it looks like the winning one was 61% of fish were native. So I have the answer for you, and it was, I wish I could see all your faces right now, 99% of the fish that we saw in Tryon Creek were native. Isn't that cool? So almost all of the fish, we captured 7,000 individual fish in all of our years of surveying, and 99% of those fish that we collected were native. And we saw tons of sculpin, which are also native. They're not included in that 7,000 number. There were so many sculpin that we would just count them as we walked by, but we wouldn't collect them because we didn't want to harass them too much. Which brings us to our next poll. How many different species of fish do you think have been found in the Tryon Creek watershed? So we found 7,000 fish, but how many of them were different species? So let me find, launching that poll. So it looks like one number is coming in strong. All right, looks like everyone voted real quick. You might be wavering. Was it only 6 species? Could it have been
tiebreaker?
Could it have been 54 species? All right, we've got a tiebreaker. I'm gonna end polling. Ta-da! Looks like the winning one, most of you thought that there were 13 different species of fish in the watershed. So I have the answer for you, and it was actually 21 different species in the watershed. So that's pretty cool. That's quite a few more species than most of you thought. So out of the 21 different species we observed, 13 of them were native species. So 8 of them were of introduced species. So we will go into one last poll that I think you'll be able to get if you were paying attention. What fish do you think is the most common fish in the Tryon Creek watershed? And I will launch that one right here. All right, this one's kind of fun. It looks like just about everyone was paying attention. So
While lampreys on there, I might ask someone, and this is a common misconception, that lamprey are invasive or problematic. And a couple of us addressed it in the chat, but if you might want to just talk about or just clarify that lamprey are native.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, Western Brook lamprey are native along with Pacific lamprey. Lamprey in general, they get a bad rap because in the Midwest, they are invasive. So in the Midwest, it's a species called the sea lamprey. And they were able to get into the Great Lakes when they opened them up for shipping. And so unintentionally, they created a passageway for a fish that was not native to the area to be able to come into a habitat where it was able to disrupt the ecosystem by feeding on all of the fish in there. So because that is such a high profile, and because invasive fish really, they are devastating to a lot of industries and economies, they get more publicity. And for a long time, you know, Western Brook lamprey, a lot of people didn't even know they existed. Or even Pacific lamprey, people thought they were trash fish, or people thought that they were, since they were parasites, they were killing salmon, but they weren't. They were evolved in this ecosystem and they belong here. So that's a great question. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we love our lamprey. And if any of you have an opportunity, definitely go to the Oregon Zoo. They have an exhibit on lamprey and how important they are to the Native Americans and to the ecosystem. So that's really cool. Thanks for asking that. So I'm going to end polling, and it looks like everyone mostly was right. Sculpin are the most abundant fish in the watershed. So thanks for that. I will circle that, figure out how to make that go away. All right, click on the next one. There we are, the little circle Sculpin. So I need to move this over here. So here is our list of species that we saw, and their quantity is kind of in a logistic scale along the bottom there. So you can see that we saw 10,000 Sculpin, and then we saw 1,000 or so coho, chinook, and coastal cutthroat trout, and hundreds of steelhead or rainbow trout, and then the rest down into the hundreds and then tens. But one thing that really kind of strikes me in this list of species is that at the top of our list of species that we saw are all salmonids that love cold water. So let's click on that right there.
Hey, Brooke, someone said goldfish?
Yes. I think I might have caught the same goldfish about 3 times, but yes, sometimes that's another thing with introduced and invasive species. Sometimes people dump their aquariums. They say, hey, you know, I don't want to take care of this fish anymore. It looks miserable here in this aquarium. I love Tryon Creek, and I'm just going to release it in there to live out its life. And what we're all learning is that introducing a fish to a system in which it hasn't evolved is pretty hard on not just the fish, but also the ecosystem. So yeah, goldfish is on that list. So you can see up here, the most abundant species were native, all in blue, and mostly up at the top of this list. And down here, these are the introduced species we saw. So in lower numbers and kind of lower down on the list. So some bass and bluegill were probably brought here as game fish. Western mosquito fish were brought in to control mosquito populations. And, you know, they just make their way in. It's a pretty common thing, especially in an urban area. And then there's one, like I talked about, we saw one invasive species, and that is the Oriental weatherfish. So that one, here's a picture of one. They are native to Eastern Asia, and in 1991, we believe that they escaped from a goldfish farm in California, and they made their way up here. And the reason why they're invasive is because they eat a lot of macroinvertebrates in the dirt, and they compete for food, and they make less food for the native fish. So we only saw 2 of them, but we did see 1 invasive fish. But let's meet some of our most abundant fish, some of our native species. These are the most common fish. So here's a sculpin. Most of them were called reticulate sculpin, but we might have had some other species mixed in there, and they're pretty tough to identify. We also have coho salmon juveniles and Chinook salmon juveniles. We also had coastal cutthroat trout. And one thing I wanted to mention was we saw up here, this is a juvenile rainbow trout or steelhead trout. So rainbow trout and steelhead trout are the same species, called Oncorhynchus mykiss. And when they're young, we don't know if they're going to go out to the ocean or not. If they stay, they are a rainbow trout, but if they go out to the ocean and come back and become anadromous, then they're steelhead trout. So we just kind of refer to these younger ones before they go out to the ocean as a little nickname as O for Oncorhynchus mykiss, O mykiss. So you might see me refer to O mykiss. And because they're both trout, they can hybridize, which is a natural phenomenon, especially lower in a system where coastal cutthroat trout and rainbow trout overlap their habitats. And we can see, we saw a handful of hybrid trout. And then here's some photos of some introduced species. Some of these we saw were smallmouth bass. There's that goldfish I caught a few times, and a young largemouth bass. So back to our species list, we classified species that were captured relatively frequently and in large numbers, and we call those dominant. So sculpin, coho, chinook, and coastal cutthroat trout. And then fish that we captured in less frequently and in fewer numbers would be O mykiss or steelhead / rainbow, and hybrids of them and coastal cutthroat trout. And then fish that we captured infrequently and in very low numbers were classified as rare, which shows all of the introduced species that we saw were rare, and salmonids were either dominant or occasional. So that's a pretty cool thing about Tryon Creek and the quality of its habitat. And then finally, we wanted to look at migration timing. So this right here, you might have seen one if you're walking around the confluence. It's an antenna we built with PVC and has wire in there, and it hooks up to a computer. And when a fish swims by, it will capture the time and date that individual fish swam by. And this is that tag that we use. It's called a passive integrated transponder for short. And it's the same kind of tag that we microchip our pets with to give them a unique ID. So we're able to inject a fish right underneath its skin with this pit tag, and that's how it's detected. So what we found was that the juvenile salmon use the confluence seasonally during their migration to the Pacific Ocean. So you can see the number of days from when we put a pit tag in a fish and the last time we ever detected the presence of that fish for Chinook, coho, and juvenile steelhead or rainbow trout was only a few weeks at the most on average. And then resident fish like coastal cutthroat trout, on average, we would detect them for about 102 days, for about over 3 months. So they were probably getting ready to spawn in the confluence habitat, getting ready to move upstream, or maybe some of them were moving downstream to check out like maybe another nearby watershed. And here I wanted to show you how cool it is using pit tags, which are also used by hatcheries to understand the amount of time a fish takes to travel from one point to another. So you can see in blue down at the bottom of your map here, the Willamette River runs through Oregon, and it has these tributaries on the Mackenzie and Santiam rivers. And these fish were released in blue, and they traveled downstream and were in turn detected in Tryon Creek on their way out to the ocean. So that was pretty exciting that we could detect fish that other people tagged. And then people could detect the fish that we tagged elsewhere. You can see further down in yellow up at the top of your screen, this toad array. This was an antenna that gets dragged around by a boat, and they detected juvenile fish moving out into the Pacific Ocean. And then You'll see right next to it also a big red square, and that is indicating a seabird colony. And they go through all of the seabird poop and they'll find pit tags in there. And that way they know that the birds probably ate that fish and get an idea of mortality rates. So another really cool thing that's happened that we saw when the fish come back as adults, we've seen a couple of adult coho and chinook detected on the Clackamas River. As adults, they'll go through a dam or go to a hatchery, and then those folks will say, hey, this fish was tagged, and they can go into the database and see who tagged it, and then they'll let me know that they saw a fish maybe a year or two after we tagged it in Tryon Creek. So just this fall, 2 coho were detected moving upstream of the Clackamas River Mill Dam, which is pretty exciting. So you can see how Tryon Creek is a small little stop along the way for the entire basin of the Willamette River. And we're getting towards the end, and I just wanted to bring it back to what we found is just how Tryon Creek provides valuable fish habitat. And some of our conclusions is that we saw habitat downstream that can support lamprey species. And we also looked at the coastal cutthroat trout population and can determine that it's established, it's relatively stable, it's abundant to persist and maintain its abundance near capacity, seeing that it's in all of the habitat that we sampled. Also, the confluence habitat can be used by salmonids and other native fish. It shows how valuable that confluence is to off-channel habitat. Like I said earlier, the winter flooding of the Willamette River creates these really strong currents, and these juvenile salmonids can dip into Tryon Creek for 3 weeks, a month. And then they can continue out to the ocean. And then finally, you know, one of our big goals was, you know, how did this habitat enhancement work, and seeing that fish use the habitat and that they are able to migrate and pass freely through it, is that this habitat enhancement can promote conservation of various species. And coming to the future is, although the monitoring is concluded for the first 2 phases of the Highway 43 culvert project, it still leads us to have this data that we can compare to after the Highway 43 culvert is removed. And the questions that, you know, we'd love to answer and we'll probably have is, will the fish community change? Will non-native fish move upstream? Because right now it's all coastal cutthroat trout and native fish like sculpin. Will they be able to pass upstream of that Tryon Creek Highway 43 culvert? Are the proportion of native and non-native fish, will that change downstream? Could there even be a change in the abundance of migratory and resident salmonids? So it's great that we've got these baseline data to see if there is change over time. And a big question is, if the passage is made more accessible, will adult salmon or lamprey move upstream in Tryon Creek for any amount of time? So we can use all of our data to look at the future. And with that, I will hand it off to Chad, and just wanted to thank everyone for listening and bearing with me. So thank you. I will try to stop sharing my little screeny screen.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Brooke. Yeah, we are ready to let Chad get our screen share going. As I'm sure is a familiar thing for everyone, we were troubleshooting some screen share stuff earlier. So Chad, if you want to go ahead and get your screen share started, we can see how it's going. Right now you are still on mute. And just to answer one of the questions while we work on that transition, someone inquired about the crayfish or crawdads in the watershed. And rather than putting the onus on Chad and Brooke to answer, I know you two are fish biologists. You might know, Brooke, you were nodding or saying something. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pop into the chat a handy list of how to tell apart our native signal crayfish from invasive crayfish. And there are some invasive crayfish that do pretty well in the area. But yeah, for now I'll yield over to Chad here.
Okay.
Thanks for the great questions, everyone.
Okay. What are you seeing? You
We
see
are
the
seeing
first slide?
the full screen of your slide.
Okay, great. We'll see. Maybe this will work as planned. I'm going to talk about two things. The first will be an overview of the Boones Ferry culvert replacement with a bridge, that project that's currently underway now, as most of you know, as well as just a brief overview of some culvert pieces in Tryon and just some general culvert information. You see the new, the second slide?
We're still just seeing your first slide.
Yeah.
It's doing that funny thing it was when we were on earlier.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me stop sharing and go over to the other way.
Cool. While you're doing that, Chad, I noticed some people are tuning in from across the country and across the ocean. We registered this event with World Fish Migration Day, which is on Saturday. And I'm curious if those of you tuning in from outside of the Portland area found out because of World Fish Migration Day. So if you want to put that in the chat, that would be cool for us to hear. So Chad, now we can see basically whatever slide on the left you click on, we'll be able to see at large.
Great, okay. Okay, so here's a picture of the creek in a bit of a dewatered state. And when I say dewatered, I mean that the water has been diverted around the project area so that we can, or so the construction folks can do their construction work in the stream, in the dry. And in the summer months, that's when we have this in-water work window, it's called. And I think it's maybe July 15th through the end of September, I think is when that is for Tryon Creek. The beginning of the project started February 2020. As most of you know, this road is shut off. It's a big detour, and it appears that the end date for this project will be spring of 2020. It has crept forward a bit. The construction cost, that's construction only, not design and permits and all that, is almost $5 million, just shy of $5 million. Bridges are expensive in comparison to culverts. The main reason for this project is that we had sewer pipes that were exposed along Tryon Creek above the culverts. And this often happens because sewer pipes are placed oftentimes next to creeks as a path of least resistance. And they'll be next to creeks, over creeks, under creeks, and over time, streams move laterally or they incise and they expose sewer pipes. And we don't want those to leak, sewage into Tryon Creek, and we would, be fined. And so we need to do something to shore up those crossings. And what we do is we put, in this instance, we put rock and boulders and build weirs. And then we also have another piece, large component of this project is the fish passage to Upper Tryon Creek. Now that there is a bridge, as you can see in the first photo, there's a bridge over the culvert. The culvert has currently been removed, and now fish can, this culvert was a partial fish passage barrier flow dependent. And so now fish will be able to access the upper portion of the watershed where they used to, you know, could only get up there seasonally. Also, we had some maintenance issues up on the upstream side of the old culvert. There's a very large trash rack that would create flooding, and it's difficult to get down in there to remove the debris that gets caught on the upstream side of the trash rack. And that also would partially impede fish passage. We also get out of this project a trail connectivity from the, you know, upstream to the downstream, depends on, I guess, whichever way you're walking, connectivity in the park above and below the culverts. You got that next slide? Great. Okay, good. So there's a picture of the culvert that was put in around 1920, and you can see that the bridge is up above, and they laid back the banks and got rid of you know, tons and tons of road fill. And it's kind of neat to see that culvert that hasn't been exposed for almost 100 years. That culvert was perched, and when I mean perched, on the downstream side of the culvert, it wasn't touching the water surface elevation on the downstream side. So the fish had to jump, and it was, you know, about a 6-inch to a foot perched culvert there. And so that's one of the reasons why we have a fish barrier here. The culvert is a 60-inch corrugated metal pipe, and it's about 150 feet long. And over that 150 feet, we increase in elevation 3 feet from, you know, 141 on the downstream side to 144 feet above mean sea level. Here's a picture of the trash rack. You can see the bridge above, and this is at the confluence of Arnold and Tryon. And, you know, the wood racks up, and oftentimes you'll get a lot more wood than that, bigger pieces of wood. And it's really, you know, a logistical nightmare to get down in that area to bring equipment down there to remove the debris from that trash rack. And it's interesting that it's also that trash rack is at the confluence of two creeks. Usually we don't see two creeks coming together at a trash rack location. And again, this next slide, you know, it's kind of cool that you can see all the way through the old culvert. And again, the dewatered pool down below, and, you know, the excavator doing its work above the pipe, and then the bridge up above. This bridge, what it does for humans and wildlife is that it allows passage from the lower Tryon to the upper Tryon Creek watershed, which is really awesome. You know, we got the trail, we got the trail for humans, the natural stream bottom for fish, and the trail also for wildlife, and along the stream margins for wildlife as well, so that they don't have to deal with the cars, you know, going very fast there. If anybody's walked around there, it was, you know, scary to walk across there with all the bends, and there's, you know, no shoulders and no sidewalk. There will be a sidewalk on the bridge. There's about 370 feet of in-stream work performed, so that was the area that was dewatered. 8 weirs were installed to protect the sewer pipe, as well as get the grade. So, you know, we had about 4 feet from the total project from the top to bottom, and these kind of help as step pools for the fish to get up, as well as they, provide great and hydraulic control with these large boulders. And these boulders are engineered so that they will stay there, hopefully for all the flows that we'll ever see there. The overall stream slope is about 3%. There was 28 pieces of large woody debris added. So large woody debris are, tree roots with the root wad and the sticks. These provide, they slow flows, they protect banks, they increase the fish habitat. Fish really like to hang out in there, keep away from predators. So now we don't have a trash rack, which is less maintenance and less, money that the city has to spend in time. And, the city also, at, one point in time, got a fine from DSL a few years ago, going into that wetland to try to clear, I believe, the trash rack. And we don't have that issue anymore now that we don't have the trash rack. The trash rack was really, would cause a lot of flooding upstream and, somewhat of a safety concern when you have all that water impounded above that road prism fill. It's, engineers don't like to see that. And as well as we have the, bit of a increased safety for pedestrian crossing at that location. This next slide shows the design drawings, and there's some elevation. It's kind of hard to see in this view that I have you on right now because of what's going on with the presentation, but these large circles, we'll call them, those are the Boulder Weirs. Can you see my cursor?
We can, yes.
Great.
I love seeing blueprints. It blows my mind.
Yeah, so this is where the sewer pipe crossing is, well, I guess the sewer pipe crossing is right about here, or actually I think it's right here. So as the water comes down, it actually slows down, reduces velocity, reduces scour, and then they put a bunch of rock on top of the sewer pipe and on top of the boulders and just upstream of the boulders to kind of create some steps. And those, again, boulders are designed to stay there during whatever flows Tryon Creek throws at those boulders. You can kind of see this is the footprint of that culvert that was there. You can see it's slanted. It's got some slope to it. When you do that, you increase velocities for fish. It's not, good, and it's corrugated, and, it's 150-foot long culvert. That gets to be quite a bit for fish to be able to manage to go through. Here is
Chad, are those elevations above sea level?
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, I thought that they were.
Sounds right to me.
Yeah. It says elevation right here. So yeah. So, here's a boulder weir, which is underneath. That's this one right here. And then there's another weir. I think that one is right here, which you can see here. And I don't know if you're familiar exactly with this, but this is the old pipe crossing kind of footprint would be in here, and the roadway or the bridge is along here. This is downstream of Boons, and this is Arnold here. And then Tryon in the sewer pipe protection area. It's kind of cool to see the existing trees, and they show wetland locations on here, and widths and topography. And here's another one, strips back some of that elevation and shows where the large wood is going to be placed. Those 28 pieces. You'll notice most of them, all of them, I guess, the root wads are protruding into the stream. And again, that slows the velocities. They create scour pools, and fish like to hang out in that area so that they can avoid predators like birds from up top. And as part of this project, while the pipe was still, it was unearthed, but while it was still present and the bridge up top was there, it's kind of interesting to see the bridge and the culvert at the same time. It's only, was happening for about a month or so out of 100 years of it being there. So it's kind of an interesting thing to show. We did this fish salvage, and we got the same species that Brook got, but during the salvage out of that dewatered area, we caught cutthroat trout, 73 of them, reticulate sculpin, almost 1,200. That's very consistent with Brook's findings. A lot of crawfish, signal crawfish, and some coastal giant salamanders. We did find those in the juvenile state. They were not adults. And again, like Brook, we had 100% native species. That's good news. We don't, like Brook said, we don't really find many waterways, that only have, that have 100% native species in Portland. Oftentimes, we have some small creeks that have no species because there's culverts down near the Willamette and they may block passage up or upstream, but really having 100% native species is really awesome. Although I'm still kind of curious whatever happened to the red side shiners and the dace. I don't know if they got blown out in years past or what, but Tryon's interesting that it really only has above Highway 43 cutthroat and sculpin. It's something you usually find some dace and shiners. And this is a project, the pre and post project. This is the downstream side. You can see that on the left, all the road prism fill, there's a ton of it. And you can see that the culvert is perched. And so, the fish would use that pool and jump into that culvert and try to get through. And depended on this time of year, is there a lot of water, too much, get blown back, too little water, can't make it all the way through in a corrugated metal pipe for 150 feet or so. And then on the right, you see the bridge, you see the road prism fill is gone, and you see that big pool now runs all the way upstream, and there is no culvert. And really, bridges are the best thing that you can do from a fish perspective, and oftentimes a flow perspective. Fish certainly like natural substrate instead of a man-made structure, that's for sure. So anytime we can get a bridge, we're loving it. Fish are loving it. It does cost a bit more though, that's for sure. And this shows the old culvert with high velocities coming through. That's after, or during a rain event. And down below, you can kind of see roughly where the trail is going to be. If you go vertical on here, the trail is going to be on this side. Here's the human in the trail walking, so it'll be over here. And then the removal of the road fill prism. Here's where the old culvert was, and here's where the new channel is. And it's been 100 years since we've had a natural stream bed running underneath Boones Ferry, which is pretty darn cool. There we're showing pedestrians crossing on the sidewalks up here. And then so the last photo on top showed Boones Ferry with a lot of flow coming through that culvert. Tryon Creek is different than most urbanized creeks in that the development is actually in the headwaters rather than, other streams usually have development in the lower part of the streams. What we have here is Tryon Creek State Park So, you know, Tryon is kind of flips from the traditional urban stream model, which is very unique. But what that does is, you know, in stormwater, when it rains, the rain hits roofs, it hits impervious surfaces such as streets and driveways. And oftentimes the water is shunted to pipes and goes into the creek. And then we increase velocities and the creek down cuts and in sizes and changes the stream from what it normally was. And here's the Highway 43 culverts. We'll talk a little bit about culverts here. The Highway 43 culvert, which Brook talked about. I think you saw the same photo, actually. You know, it was a partial fish barrier. It was retrofitted in 2008 to address the jump height, as well as they put in some different kinds of baffles to reduce the flows, or the velocities through that culvert. It's about a 450, 450 foot in length there. Over that 450 foot length, it rises about 6 to 8 feet. So, you know, that's quite a bit in a pipe. Fish don't do so well with that much rise in that long of a, that's a lot of rise, and it's a lot of length from a fish perspective. The culvert has baffles. I think we're on the second retrofitting of the baffles. I think they may have done one retrofit from the original culvert, maybe in the early 90s or late 80s. And then they gave it another try in 2008. This culvert is part of the Corps of Engineers WRDA project for the Willamette, and WRDA is the Water Resource Development Act. And right now we're waiting to hear, and it's not going to be anytime soon, I don't think, when the congressional funding could be coming to help with this project. I think I saw an estimate one time on this culvert to replace with a bridge, and I think it came in at like $28.5 million. You know, there's so many utilities and railroads and roads. There's a lot of stuff in, you know, there's a ton of fill there to remove, and, you know, dealing with the railroad, they, you know, don't want their lines shut down. And, you know, when this, I've always kind of said that when this culvert is replaced, then I can retire. I'd like to see that before I retire one day. Hopefully it'll happen. It's great to see that we're actually being considered for some federal funding for this project, although I'm not holding my breath anytime soon, especially now, but it's been elevated. Then I'd like to talk about some different instances of fish passage barriers on culverts. And you'll notice the top one, A, is a velocity barrier. You'll notice that the culvert is rather steep compared to the other photos. It's high velocities, fish don't like that. The one below that, let's see, what is that? The flow, there's not enough flow inside the culvert for the fish to be able to keep swimming up. Another example of what can happen is C, the top right. You know, it doesn't have a pool that's deep enough, and the velocities are very high in this. It's hard for them to get their jump on. And then D, the bottom right, is the jump is just too high. And fish, one thing to note is fish, if they have, for instance, a culvert that's perched 6 inches above the pool's water surface elevation, they're going to need a pool that's 1.5 times the jump height, or in this case, 9 inches, to be able to swim down in the pool and then swim up to try to get inside the culvert in this instance. And so, you know, we need some deep pools in order to get above these culverts oftentimes. And for instance, this one, which we saw in Brook's presentation, it appears. Stone Bridge, look at that. We have a perched culvert of, you know, what is that, 18 inches maybe? Out of a culvert into a pool that looks relatively shallow, you know, compared to the 1.5 times. So what was that? We need a pool depth of, what is that, 27 inches if we want to try to clear this. I don't know that we have 27 inches there. There's not much water inside that culvert anyway. Looks like it's under a low flow condition, but no worries now because we have a bridge. Again, the best thing that you'd like to see in a situation like this replaced with the bridge. Natural stream bottom, fish love it. And then we have the Atwater Culvert. You can see this is a situation here where the water coming out of the culvert lands on rocks with a large jump height. You know, fish aren't going to be able to pass through that culvert. This is our City of Portland culvert layer for Arnold Creek and Tryon Creek Watershed Council. You guys have your database, and I like how you guys have a bunch of dams or bridges in the park, which we don't have mapped at all. And we have a couple more culverts on here than what you guys do. I kind of look at the main stem. This green dot is the Boones Ferry culvert, and there are 6 culverts on the main stem. I took the main stem to here. Maybe I should have went down here, but 6 culverts on that section of about approximately 2 miles of that just main stem habitat or in-stream length for all of Arnold. And as some of you guys know, there also is a impassable feature in Arnold at about, I think it's 18th place around there is where the Arnold Falls are. And so you'd have a population of likely cutthroat above and below, because fish will never be able to get past the Arnold Falls. I don't know if any of you have been there. I believe it's on private property. It's really beautiful to see. And, if you don't know it's there, then you don't know it's there, but it's a natural fish passage impediment. And here's the Tryon Creek culverts above Boones Ferry. Again, the green dot is Boons, and this is the main stem. Here's I-5, and all these dots are culverts. Some of these are on tribs, some are on the main stem. I think there's, 7 culverts up to I-5 from Boones Ferry. And, above I-5, there's not a ton of water quantity, and there's a ton of culverts. Oftentimes they're, mixed in with private culverts. Private culverts can be a little bit more difficult to access. You have to have landowner permissions, and some people don't want their, driveways torn up and all that stuff. Above Boones Ferry, we have about 9,000 feet of main stem habitat up to I-5, and above I-5, I think we have another 3,000 feet of main stem in-stream habitat. And that's what I have for my updates here. Feel free to ask your questions.
Great, thank you, Chad. We do have some questions. I'm going to read them on off. So let me bring the notes I've been taking right over here. Let's see. What do I want to ask first? So someone asked, you mentioned the problem, and this was during Brook's presentation, the problem of private lands, and aren't old waterways considered public? And so to answer that question, generally or broadly speaking, navigable waterways are public, and so the water itself might be public, but in our watershed, some creeks do run through private property, So the land right adjacent to the creek can be in private ownership, which when we're looking at a restoration project is probably going to become pretty relevant. So Chad, what are the purpose of the trash racks? Is it just to snag debris? And a follow-up question, I was curious, you mentioned that it was a little unusual for the trash racks to be at a confluence of two creeks, and I was wondering what the implications of that were. Like, did it just make the project more expensive or the issues more problematic?
Just, I've never really seen a trash rack at the confluence of two creeks. I don't know that, there's no rule that says that you shouldn't have a trash rack at the confluence, but I can't think of another place in the city where I've seen that. It's a bit of an anomaly. It's kind of a weird thing to see when you look at a confluence reach. You see this large monstrosity of a trash rack. It's just out of the norm. And what was the first part of the question?
They were asking what the purpose of the trash racks were.
Yeah, so to not clog up the culvert. If you can keep the wood on the upstream side, the thought is that it wouldn't get jammed inside this 150-foot long culvert, and it's difficult to go inside and pull out blockages from inside a flowing culvert in the winter time when it usually happens. And so they just say, hey, we're going to keep it out of the pipe. We're going to put it on the upstream side. And, they'll have to get on a cleaning schedule. Most trash racks are on a cleaning schedule because the trash impedes flow.
Yeah, thank you. Brooke, there was a question about how far up the watershed did you find anadromous fish?
That's a really good question. So when we've been in there collecting fish for our abundance estimate, I have seen one or two coho juveniles. I've seen one just above the culvert, and then I have seen one that was just below Boones Ferry Road. And then I think in maybe 2009, I was doing an abundance estimate, and we were just dropping into Marshall Park. So it wasn't part of the abundance estimate. And we actually found a juvenile coho up there. And it had a little bit of scarring on it. So it could have been regurgitated from a bird or dropped. It could have swam up there. I can't say that it didn't, but I was there and I saw it. So that's as far as it goes that I've seen.
Thanks. Someone just asked, do the fish behave or engage with the culverts as a true waterfall, or do they try to jump it in a different manner, Chad or Brooke? Maybe Chad, since you were talking culverts.
I think the same way. Yeah, I don't think they don't, I've never asked them, but I don't think that they know the difference between a culvert and a waterfall, Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to follow up with Glenn real quick. You're asking that how could the native species be 99% for what we captured? And so I was just doing the math off the top of my head. So I don't know if you're looking at the figure we had where it had the list of species, and so Sculpin were about 10,000 of those individuals. And then, but if we counted up all of the individual fish, we captured about 7,000 individuals, and only about 70 of those individual fish were non-native. And the logistic scale at the bottom kind of makes it look like there were more. It was just so we could fit them all in there. So the most abundant non-native fish, we only captured 39 smallmouth bass. And so around 70 divided by 7,000 is where I got the 99%. I did a little bit of math. I questioned myself like I always do, but that's how I got the number. I was like, maybe I messed up a decimal, but you can always follow up with me. Thanks for checking.
Yeah, the axis on that graph was a good one to catch because the spacing between like 1 and 100 was the same between like 1,000 and 10,000 or something. So I can understand.
Exactly. It was definitely hard to see. It was the only way to get them all even off.
To make the smaller ones actually show on the bars. Yeah. Let's see. So there was some fun conversation in the chat about fish jumping. Basically, Chad, someone was saying that there's of course also a limitation on how high fish can jump, and then we started talking about flying fish and rapid evolution. But I was wondering, how high are the jumps that our fish take? I don't know.
Well, I mean, it depends on the species and it depends on the life stage. I mean, if it's a Chinook, or well, I guess the best jumpers are steelhead, I guess, and they can jump, I don't know, a few feet as adults. As juvenile, oftentimes with culverts, we have the 6-inch rule, that's the minimum jump height for salmonids. So basically, when we do any of our in-stream features that are steps, or when we look at culverts, existing culverts, or if we were to retrofit some dam features like we did in Kelly Creek, we look to have a maximum jump height of 6 inches.
Gotcha.
So the drop maximum 6 inches.
Okay, thank you. Brooke, we had a question come in from Facebook. What's your opinion of the habitat in Tryon for spawning when the culvert, I'm guessing they mean the Highway 43 culvert, eventually comes out?
Yeah, well, for large salmonids spawning, if there is habitat there, it's a very flashy system also because it's urbanized. I think for a large fish, I'm not so certain for it being spawning habitat for large anadromous salmonids. Biologists are always wrong though. But I think what it will do will create a lot of really quality habitat for all of those juvenile salmonids that are moving downstream of the Willamette. More habitat for them to maybe overwinter before they go out to the ocean so they can go out stronger and healthier.
Awesome. I think we're just about wrapping up. Someone from out of state did ask if dams are also a problem on creeks in Oregon. Yes, they are. They're responsible for a really large decline in salmon populations. I think we will just go ahead and wrap up. One thing, if you guys are curious to learn a little bit more about the Tryon Creek watershed, I just wanted to plug an online interactive map that we have, where you can turn on things like places where roads cross with the stream. You can see hiking trails, and also some of that habitat evaluation use from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So that's at our website at just tryoncreek.org/interactive map. You can find it pretty easily on there. But thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Brooke. Thank you, Chad. We have a couple more questions plugging in, but I think we'll just let folks log off for now. And Connie, I can follow up with you.
Thanks. I saw one question in there real quick about how to get to the Confluence Habitat area.
Yeah.
The access point is on Stamper Road under the train trestle, and it's on City of Portland property. And I don't know the ins and outs of access, but I don't know, Alexis, if you know if people can go walk around there.
I think it's technically private property. I know that BES crews are out there doing some, invasive plant work. I'm not positive. I know from Foothills Park, you can walk along the trail and kind of peek down and see the Confluence Habitat though.
It's from Stanford, and then Tryon Cove is the city of Legasvigo, and it is right next to the city of Portland's wastewater treatment plant. There's a lot of overlapping jurisdictions there, but yeah, you can access it from a couple different spots from Stanford Road.
Thank you. That's our board chair, Glenn, here filling in good gaps in my knowledge.
Great, thank you.
All right. Thank you again, everyone, so much. I think I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting, but feel free to email us with any other questions. My email address, you have it because I sent you the Zoom link through it. So once again, Chad, Brooke, thank you all so much. Thanks again to BES for funding
Thank you.
our project. Thanks
Thank you. Stay happy and healthy.
for take care.